I wanted to give a quick just overview of the Debt Collective. We are going to talk about the Debt Collective more, as Jason said, through Lauren, but I think just to let people know that the Debt Collective has, been working for years now, really at the front lines of really trying to change and reframe the conversation around student loan debt as not an issue where people made bad personal choices, but as a failed policy design, as a policy that made those who didn't have the means really make a situation or make a choice where when they didn't have other options, which the choice was to borrow student loans. And a part of what the Debt Collective has increasingly worked to do and been successful at is bring together student loan borrowers, building collective power, and then using that power to put pressure on the Department of Ed, on advocates, on policymakers to really change how we're thinking about student loans and the failure of funding higher education through student loans. So the Debt Collective has won billions of dollars in cancellation for students who were defrauded by their institution. They have won new policies and regulations to protect student loan borrowers. And again, the whole mission and strategy of the Debt Collective is to bring together borrowers so that you don't feel the shame and isolation of carrying your debt by yourself, but you feel the power of us having this collective experience and being able to collectively advocate for a new way forward. So just to start out, I think it's, always important, to introduce myself and just my journey to this work and this advocacy, and why I think, building this collective power is what's needed to address not only student loans, but really to address this increasing policy reliance. If we need something as everyday people, the solution in policy is to give it to us as debt. And if that's healthcare, if that's education, if that's housing, if that's just everyday living expenses and desires, there's this idea that for us to access it, we have to go through debt. And I went to higher ed and was able to go to an institution where I had a full financial aid package, a full scholarship, but still had to borrow student loans in order to just handle the everyday living expenses of my life, of my family life. And I tell people that even while individually I do not care a large amount of student loan debt, I'm connected to a family where between my parents and my siblings, we collectively think through and struggle through the fact that we have around $500,000 of student loan debt across us. And that means that we are borrowing money from each other. We're showing up and trying to provide support in many different ways because of the reality of this debt that's constantly extracting while at the same time increasing. So in this quick presentation, I'm going to take about 10 minutes to just let everyone understand why I say student loans is a policy failure, and that you did not fail at your student loans, but the design of using loans was something that was really a predictable failure from the beginning. And then after that 10 minutes, we'll give everyone a chance to ask questions around student loan policy, around the work we're doing. And then Jason will talk about free college, which is kind of the other side of this issue, and how we make sure the student loan crisis doesn't continue to grow in the future. So many of you probably have seen that student loans now are over $1.7 trillion. The majority of this student loan balance is controlled by the federal government. So the Department of Education controls a $1 trillion plus student loan portfolio. So you can think about them in many ways as almost operating as a bank, though they're supposed to be operating as this facilitator of opportunity and access. So overall, when we look at the student loan debt for everyone, we know the average student is graduating from college with around $29,000 of student loan debt. We know that each year, 1 million new people default on their student loan debt. And when we look at student loans, so a part of why we call this a crisis and we call it a policy failure is not only the people who are defaulting, which we know is 1 million new people each year, but when we look at 60% of loans just from 2013 to 2015, people have not paid down those loans. So 60% of those loans actually have increased at a higher, their balances have increased to a higher rate than when they were originally originated. So you always have to understand the student debt crisis as those who are defaulting, really having wages garnished, experiencing some of the worst consequences of not being able to repay your loans. But there's many of us who are making $0 payments or making, just what we can do, but we're really not repaying that overall principal. So the student debt crisis is about default, but also about just not having the ability to repay and keep up with these ever-growing interest rates. And in the last decade, we have seen the overall student loan balance grow by 107%. So this chart just kind of shows what has happened, not only since 2010, over the last decade, but even since 2007, just the steady growth of the total outstanding student loan balance. So right now, there's many different proposals around what to do with student loan debt. And in the Debt Collective, we advocate for a full student debt cancellation because of many of these proposals that are sometimes will argue that we don't need any cancellation. We need to make income-based repayment plans better, or Biden, who's arguing for only 10,000, or even Elizabeth Warren and others who are arguing for 50,000. We know that from the decades of evidence that we have, that student debt cancellation that's limited or that makes people jump through many different hoops simply will not work. So we argue for full debt cancellation. And this chart shows that even when you do $50,000 of cancellation, you're still going to leave out a lot of different borrowers. So if you look at what's highlighted in the yellow, if we look at just the second row, so these are people who make 26,000 to 46,000 in the second row. And then if you go to the last column that's highlighted in yellow, it says that even if you cancel $50,000 of student debt, that's only going to cover about 70% of people in that category. But we're going to still leave 30% in this category as Black borrowers, 30% of Black borrowers without experiencing that debt cancellation. And that, continues to hold steady as we move up to income categories. And this is important because when we hear 50,000, often the conversation is, well, that's better than 10. But what I keep trying to argue and make sure people understand is that there's a difference between getting the cancellation that we can get versus getting the cancellation that we need. And in the Debt Collective, we argue very clearly that the evidence shows, the experiences show that we need full debt cancellation. So what's also important here is that we have to understand that debt experience differently, particularly across race, and that when we look at Black borrowers, they're experiencing the worst of what we're seeing with this failed policy. So already it's always important to remember the context and the history of this country, that Black people and many communities of color are entering a higher education system with already pre-existing structural racism, generational economic exploitation, and they're being asked to enter this system and participate in it without really any type of attention or redress based on the history of that racism. So we know that the majority of high school students enroll in higher education, including Black students, but Black students more than any other group borrow student loans. So 90% of Black students who enroll in higher ed borrow student loans. We know that as people are navigating the higher education system, they're not seeing that return in graduation rates. So often Black students are making the choice to attend higher ed. They are doing what they have to do, such as borrowing student loans, but the institutions they have access to often are for-profit institutions that aren't even investing in resources to make sure the degrees actually have a return on them, or they're accessing institutions that simply are underfunded historically or currently. That also means they don't have the resources to support what the students need. When we look at Black students who actually graduate with a bachelor's degree, and this is why 50,000 simply is not enough. When we look at Black bachelor's degree earners 4 years after they graduate, they have an average balance of $53,000. So already they're above that threshold of 50,000 just 4 years after they graduate. And we know a big part of this is because Black bachelor's degree earners are telling us, and I just completed a national study on this, that if you're Black trying to navigate this labor market, it's not enough to just have your bachelor's, that you have to be twice as credentialed to get the same job that others are able to get with a bachelor's or no degree. So we know that Black students with a bachelor's are actually going to graduate school at 3 times the rate as their white counterparts, meaning that we're really relying on graduate school to hopefully be a buffer or that boost to get us into the labor market. And as many of you have already shared in your testimony, is that you're dealing with a labor market that consistently underemploys and just simply does not employ Black people with or without a degree. So what we have seen when we're talking about the student debt crisis is that it's overall impacting all student loan borrowers, that the people who borrow debt are not the rich or the wealthy. They are people who do not have the means, so they have to rely on student loan debt to access that. But that is true for Black borrowers more than any other group. So 12 years after Black people have borrowed student loans, they still owe 114% of their original balance, meaning that our balances have actually increased by 14% 12 years after we have borrowed. And when we look at Black borrowers 20 years after they have borrowed, we have only paid down on average about 5%. So we still owe about 95% of our original balance. And I share this because it's important when we're talking about cancellation solutions that we are clear that any solution that is not considering the racial and gender and power experiences of marginalized groups is, even if it's universal, even if it's supposed to include everyone, is historically and very likely going to fail. That you have to be conscious of these different experiences of those on the margins to make sure that they're included in cancellation, to make sure that they're included in these solutions. But this illustration also shows that student loan debt simply has failed as a policy, and it has failed especially for Black people, which is why we argue that it's a racial justice issue. So just to wrap this up, often when people ask me why isn't $50,000 enough, I simply show them this chart that when Elizabeth Warren and others were coming up with their plan, they used 2016 data. And that data, if you look at 2016 and see the 3 dots, it shows Black, Latinx, and white borrowers. You see that those 3 dots are somewhat close in 2016. But by 2019, the median debt for Black households, has grown by so much that just in 3 years, they couldn't rely on that 2016 data. So for the $50,000 to actually come anywhere near hitting the thresholds that is in the proposal, it would actually have to be increased to at least 75,000. But still, we argue that even 75,000 is not enough because it leaves too many borrowers, particularly Black borrowers, without cancellation, without experiencing the full relief that they need before the pandemic, but need especially now.